The letter arrived at the trading post in the Montana Territory on a Tuesday morning in April of 1876, carried by a trapper who had hauled it across 300 miles of wilderness, and when Jacob Hayes opened the worn envelope with hands that could snap a man's neck but trembled at the delicate paper, he had no idea that the words inside would change the entire direction of his life. Jacob stood 6 feet 4 inches tall, with shoulders broad enough to block a doorway, and arms thick with muscle, earned from years of trapping beaver, hauling pelts, and surviving in the untamed mountains of the West. His dark hair hung past his collar, sun-streaked and wild, framing a face weathered by wind and sun, but still young at 26 years old. He had lived alone in these mountains for nearly 8 years, ever since leaving his family's farm in Ohio at 18, seeking the freedom and solitude that only the wilderness could provide. He had not expected to find a reason to leave. The letter was from a woman named Catherine Morgan, and it began with an apology. She explained that she had found his name in a correspondence journal kept by the Western Settlers Exchange, an organization that connected people across the vast distances of the frontier. She had written to him on a whim, she said, after reading a brief description he had submitted years ago during a moment of loneliness. That description had mentioned his life in the mountains, his love of the wilderness, and a single line that had caught her attention. Sometimes a man wonders if freedom is just another word for being alone. Catherine wrote that she understood that feeling more than he might imagine. She lived in a small town called Riverbend in eastern Kansas, where she worked as a schoolteacher for children of settlers and farmers. She was 24 years old, unmarried, and had spent most of her life caring for her younger siblings after their mother died. Now her siblings were grown and married, and she found herself living in a boarding house, teaching her students, and wondering if there was more to life than the routine she had built. Her letter was thoughtful and warm, filled with observations about the changing seasons, the struggles of frontier life, and the small joys she found in teaching children to read. She asked him questions about his life in the mountains, about what he had seen and experienced, and she closed by saying she hoped he would not mind if she wrote to him again. She signed it simply, "With hope, Catherine." Jacob read the letter 3 times that first day, standing in the dim light of the trading post while the owner watched him with curious eyes. Something in Catherine's words reached past the walls he had built around himself. He had chosen solitude deliberately, believing that a man who lived by his own strength needed no one else. But her letter reminded him of a loneliness he had tried to ignore, a hollow space that no amount of wilderness could fill. He wrote back that same evening, sitting by the fire in his small cabin with a stub of pencil and paper he had bartered for at the trading post. His words came awkwardly at first. He was a man more comfortable with action than expression, but he found himself telling her about the mountains he loved, the crystal lakes that reflected the sky, the elk that moved through the valleys in the early morning mist. He told her about the harsh winters and the spring thaws, about the satisfaction of living by his own hands. And he admitted, in a moment of honesty that surprised him, that her question had struck true. Sometimes freedom did feel lonely. He took the letter to the trading post the next morning and paid a ridiculous sum to ensure it would make its way east. Then he went back to his trapping, trying not to think about whether she would write again. She did. 6 weeks later, another letter arrived, longer than the first. Catherine thanked him for his response and said his descriptions of the mountains had made her dream of seeing them herself. She wrote about her students, about a young boy who had finally learned to read after months of struggle, about the satisfaction of watching understanding dawn in a child's eyes. She wrote about the town of Riverbend, about the families who struggled to make their farms productive in the Kansas soil, about the community dances and church socials that marked the passage of time. But she also wrote about her own restlessness, about the feeling that she was living a life that had been chosen for her rather than one she had chosen herself. She wrote about watching the wagon trains pass through town, heading west toward new territories, and wondering what it would be like to be brave enough to seek something different. Jacob found himself waiting for her letters the way he had once waited for the first snow of winter or the spring breakup of ice on the rivers. Each letter revealed more of who she was: intelligent, compassionate, curious about the world beyond her small town. She asked him questions that made him think, about why he had chosen the wilderness, about what he hoped to find in his solitary life. In return, he found himself opening up in ways he never had with another person, sharing thoughts and feelings he had barely acknowledged to himself. Over the next year, their correspondence deepened. Catherine's letters became more personal, more vulnerable. She wrote about the death of her mother when Catherine was only 16, about the weight of responsibility she had carried raising her 3 younger siblings. She wrote about the suitors who had courted her over the years, good men from good families, and how she had turned them all away because marrying them would have felt like giving up some essential part of herself. Jacob wrote about his own past, about growing up on a farm where his father had expected him to follow in his footsteps, to marry a local girl and raise crops in the same soil his grandfather had worked. He wrote about the day he had realized he could not live that life, no matter how much it disappointed his family. He wrote about the guilt he still carried for leaving, and about the peace he had found in the mountains that made that guilt bearable. Their letters became a lifeline, a connection that bridged the vast distance between them. Jacob found himself thinking about Catherine constantly, imagining her voice, wondering about the color of her eyes. He kept her letters in a wooden box he had carved himself, reading them over during the long winter nights when the snow piled high against his cabin walls. In the spring of 1877, more than a year after that first letter had arrived, Catherine wrote something that changed everything. She told him about an incident in Riverbend. A man named Harold Brennan, the son of one of the wealthiest landowners in the county, had decided that Catherine should marry him. When she refused his proposal, he had not accepted her answer. He had begun appearing at the schoolhouse, waiting for her after classes. He had shown up at the boarding house where she lived, insisting on speaking with her despite her repeated refusals. The situation had grown increasingly uncomfortable, and Catherine wrote that she felt trapped. The town sided with Harold, she explained. His family owned half the businesses in Riverbend, and people depended on their goodwill. When Catherine complained about Harold's persistence, she was told she should feel flattered by his attention, that she was being unreasonable to refuse such an advantageous match. The owner of her boarding house had even suggested that Catherine was being foolish to turn down a man who could provide her with such a comfortable life. Catherine's letter was different from the others. Jacob could sense the fear beneath her careful words, the way she tried to make light of a situation that clearly frightened her. She ended the letter by saying that she often thought about their correspondence, about the life he described in the mountains, and she wondered what it would be like to have the courage to simply leave everything behind and start new somewhere else. Jacob read that letter sitting on the porch of his cabin, watching the sun rise over the peaks. His hands clenched the paper hard enough to crumple the edges. The thought of Catherine being harassed, feeling unsafe and unsupported in her own town, made something fierce and protective rise in his chest. He had never met her in person, had only known her through words on paper, but in that moment, he realized that she had become more important to him than anyone else in his life. He went inside and immediately began writing. His letter was direct, without his usual careful consideration of each word. He told Catherine that she should not have to endure harassment from any man, regardless of his family's position in town. He told her that if she truly wanted to leave Riverbend, if she wanted to see the mountains she had dreamed about in her letters, then she should come west. He would meet her wherever she wanted, would help her start a new life far from men like Harold Brennan. Then, before he could second-guess himself, he wrote the words that had been building in his heart for months. Catherine, I have never met you, but I know you better than I have known anyone. Your letters have brought light into a life I thought was complete in its solitude. If you want to come west, come to me. Not as a stranger seeking help, but as a woman I would be honored to know, to protect, to build a life with, if you would have me. He sealed the letter and rode to the trading post immediately, not allowing himself time to reconsider. The owner took the letter and promised to send it on the fastest route possible. Jacob rode back to his cabin feeling both terrified and exhilarated by what he had done. The waiting was agony. Spring turned to summer, and Jacob found himself unable to focus on his work. He checked with the trading post every few days, hoping for a response. He began to fear that he had overstepped, that his boldness had frightened her away or offended her. Maybe she had simply been writing to him as a friend, as a distant correspondent to pass the time, and he had ruined it by presuming too much. Then, In late July, a letter arrived. Jacob's hands shook as he opened it. Catherine wrote that his letter had made her cry, but they were tears of relief and joy. She said that she had been afraid to hope for exactly what he offered, afraid that the connection she felt through their letters was one-sided, a creation of her own lonely imagination. But his words had given her the courage she needed. She was coming west. She would take the train as far as the rails went, then find passage on a stagecoach to reach him. She would leave Riverbend at the end of August, after the summer term at the school finished. She asked him to meet her in a town called Willow Creek in the eastern Montana Territory, the nearest settlement to his cabin that had regular stagecoach service. Jacob read her letter with his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. She was coming. Catherine Morgan, the woman whose words had reached into his solitary life and changed everything, was crossing the country to meet him. The date she planned to arrive was September 15th. Jacob counted the days obsessively. He prepared his cabin, making repairs and improvements he had been putting off for years. He built a new bed frame from pine logs, larger and more comfortable than the narrow bunk he had been sleeping on. He chinked the gaps in the walls more carefully, thinking about the cold winters and wanting the cabin to be warm and welcoming. He even rode down to the trading post and purchased fabric and supplies, things a woman might need, trying to anticipate what would make Catherine comfortable. The trading post owner, a weathered man named Silas who rarely showed much curiosity about anything, could not help but comment on Jacob's transformation. "Never seen you care about curtains before," Silas said with a dry smile as Jacob examined fabric options. "Must be something special bringing you down from those mountains." "Someone," Jacob corrected, and he could not keep the smile from his face. "Someone very special." As September approached, Jacob's anticipation mixed with nervousness. What if Catherine was disappointed when she met him in person? What if the connection they had built through letters did not translate to real life? What if she took one look at his rough cabin and his wilderness life and realized she had made a terrible mistake? But beneath the nervousness was a deeper certainty. He knew Catherine through her words, through her thoughts and dreams and fears. He knew the kindness in her heart, the strength she had shown raising her siblings, the courage it took to leave everything familiar behind. That kind of knowing went deeper than physical appearance or first impressions. On September 10th, 5 days before Catherine was due to arrive, Jacob packed supplies and began the 3-day ride to Willow Creek. He could have made the journey faster, but he brought gifts for Catherine, fresh game, pelts he had cured and crafted into warm clothing, even wildflowers he had pressed between pages of an old book, thinking she might like to see the mountain blooms she had asked about in one of her letters. Willow Creek was a small settlement clustered around a creek that ran clear and cold from the mountains. It had a general store, a saloon, a boarding house, and a stable where the stagecoaches changed horses. Jacob arrived on the evening of September 13th and took a room at the boarding house, enduring the curious stares of the locals who knew him only as the mountain man who occasionally came down to trade. He spent the 14th in a state of restless anticipation, checking and rechecking the stagecoach schedule, making sure he had not somehow miscalculated the date. He bathed in the creek, washing away the trail dust, and trimmed his beard, trying to make himself presentable. He had not been this nervous, facing down a wounded grizzly. The morning of September 15th dawned clear and bright. The stagecoach was due to arrive around noon. Jacob positioned himself outside the general store, where he could see the road, his heart beating faster every time he heard hoofbeats in the distance. Just after 1 in the afternoon, the stagecoach finally appeared, a cloud of dust marking its approach. Jacob stood, his large frame tense with anticipation. The coach pulled to a stop in front of the general store, and the driver began unloading luggage and parcels. Then, the door opened, and Catherine Morgan stepped down. Jacob's first thought was that she was more beautiful than he had imagined, though beautiful felt like an inadequate word. She was of average height, slender but not fragile, with rich brown hair pinned up beneath a simple traveling bonnet. Her face was fine-featured, intelligent, with dark eyes that looked around the settlement with a mixture of hope and nervousness. She wore a practical traveling dress in deep blue, dusty from the journey, but still neat. For a moment, they simply stared at each other across the dusty street. Jacob saw the exact moment Catherine realized who he was. Her eyes widened, taking in his size, his long hair, his buckskin clothing that marked him as a man of the wilderness. He saw her take a deep breath, and then she smiled, a brilliant expression that transformed her entire face. Jacob crossed the distance between them in a few long strides. Up close, he could see the exhaustion in her face from the long journey, but also the determination and courage that had brought her across the country. "Catherine," he said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. "Jacob." She said his name like a prayer, like a promise. "I cannot believe I'm finally here. I cannot believe you are real." "I am real," he assured her, "and you are even more than I hoped for." They stood there for a long moment, close enough to touch but not quite touching, years of letters and longing between them. Jacob wanted to pull her into his arms, to hold her, and assure himself that she was truly here, but he held back, aware of the eyes watching them from around the settlement. "Are you tired?" he asked. "The journey must have been difficult." Exhausting," Catherine admitted, "but I am too excited to care. Jacob, I left Riverbend. I actually did it. I told Harold Brennan that I would never marry him. I resigned from my teaching position, and I bought a train ticket west. My siblings thought I had lost my mind." "What did you tell them?" "The truth, that I was going to meet a man I had been corresponding with, a man I felt I knew better than anyone I had met in person. My sister said I was being reckless and romantic. My brothers wanted to forbid me from going." She laughed, the sound bright and free. "But I am 25 years old, and I make my own choices. So here I am." "Here you are," Jacob agreed, and finally he allowed himself to reach out and take her hand. Even through her traveling gloves, he could feel the warmth of her skin, the reality of her presence. "And I'm going to make sure you never regret this choice." They spent that first afternoon in Willow Creek, giving Catherine a chance to rest and recover from the journey. Jacob arranged for her luggage to be stored at the boarding house, and they walked along the creek together, talking with the ease of people who already knew each other's hearts. Catherine told him about the last few weeks in Riverbend, about how Harold Brennan had reacted badly when she told him she was leaving. He had tried to convince the boarding house owner to refuse to let Catherine leave, had even gone to the mayor to suggest that Catherine was not in her right mind and needed to be protected from herself. But Catherine had stood firm, supported by her sister who had come to Riverbend to help her prepare for the journey. "I was afraid," Catherine admitted as they sat on a fallen log beside the creek, watching the water flow past. "Afraid that I was making a terrible mistake, that I would arrive here and discover that everything I felt through your letters was just fantasy. But seeing you, talking to you..." She turned to look at him, and Jacob saw the truth shining in her dark eyes. "This is right. I know it is." "It is," Jacob agreed. He reached out and gently removed her bonnet, wanting to see her face fully in the afternoon sunlight. Her hair was coming loose from its pins, curling softly around her face. "Catherine, I need you to understand what life will be like if you come to my cabin. It is remote, miles from the nearest neighbor. The winters are harsh, and the work is constant. It is not an easy life." "I did not come here for an easy life," Catherine said firmly. "I came here for a real life, a life I choose, with a man I..." She hesitated, and a blush colored her cheeks. "With a man I have come to love through his words and his honesty." Jacob felt his heart expand in his chest, felt the last of his defenses crumble away. "I love you too," he said, the words coming easily despite his usual difficulty with emotional expression. "I have loved you since your third letter. When you wrote about teaching that boy to read and you said that helping someone discover they are capable of more than they believed is the greatest gift one person can give another, that was when I knew you were extraordinary." Catherine's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "I am not extraordinary. I am just a woman who wants to live fully, to love and be loved, to build something meaningful." "Then let me give you that," Jacob said. He slid off the log and onto one knee in the grass beside the creek, taking both of her hands in his. "I know we have only just met in person, but I know your heart, Catherine Morgan. I know your courage and your kindness and your strength. Will you marry me? Will you come to the mountains and build a life with me?" Catherine did not hesitate. "Yes," she said. And then she was laughing and crying at the same time, pulling him up from the ground and into her arms. "Yes, Jacob Hayes, I will marry you." They were married 2 days later by a circuit preacher who happened to be passing through Willow Creek. It was a simple ceremony, held in the front room of the boarding house with the owner and his wife as witnesses. Catherine wore the same blue traveling dress, and Jacob wore his cleanest buckskin shirt. They spoke their vows with their hands clasped together, promising to love and honor each other for the rest of their lives. When the preacher pronounced them married, Jacob pulled Catherine into his arms and kissed her for the first time. Her lips were soft and sweet, and kissing her felt like coming home after years of wandering. When they finally pulled apart, Catherine was blushing and smiling, her hands resting on his broad chest. "Mrs. Hayes," Jacob said, testing the sound of it. "That will take some getting used to," Catherine admitted, "but I like it." They spent their wedding night at the boarding house in a small room that Jacob had arranged for them. He was gentle with Catherine, aware that despite their deep emotional connection, they were still learning each other's physical presence. They talked late into the night, lying together in the narrow bed, sharing kisses and touches and whispered dreams for their future. The next morning, they began the journey to Jacob's cabin. Catherine rode behind him on his horse, her arms wrapped around his waist, her cheek pressed against his back. Jacob took the journey slowly, pointing out landmarks and telling her about the country they traveled through. He showed her where elk liked to graze, where the best fishing streams ran, where eagles nested in the tall pines. Catherine was full of questions, eager to learn about everything. She wanted to know the names of the plants they passed, how to read the weather in the clouds, how to tell fresh bear tracks from old ones. Jacob found himself laughing more than he had in years, delighted by her curiosity and enthusiasm. They stopped to camp the first night in a meadow filled with late summer wildflowers. Jacob set up a simple camp while Catherine explored, exclaiming over the flowers and the view of the mountains rising in the distance. They ate dinner by the fire, and Catherine told him more stories about her life in Riverbend, about her students and her siblings, and the small moments that had shaped her. "Do you miss it?" Jacob asked, watching her face in the firelight. "Your old life?" Catherine considered the question seriously. "I miss my siblings," she admitted. "I miss my students. But the life itself? No. I felt like I was slowly disappearing there, becoming smaller and quieter to fit into the space the town expected me to occupy. Here, with you, I feel like I can be fully myself." "You can," Jacob promised, "always." That night they lay together under a canopy of stars more brilliant than anything Catherine had ever seen. She curled against Jacob's side, his arm around her shoulders, and stared up at the vastness of the sky. "I never knew there were so many stars," she whispered. "Wait until you see them from the cabin," Jacob said. "On a clear winter night they are so bright you can almost read by their light." They reached the cabin late on the second day of travel. Jacob felt nervous as they approached, wondering what Catherine would think of the place that had been his home for so many years. It was small, built of pine logs with a roof of cedar shakes. The porch he had built faced east, catching the morning sun. Behind the cabin, the mountains rose in jagged peaks, their heights dusted with early snow. Catherine slid down from the horse and stood looking at the cabin and the surrounding wilderness. Jacob watched her face, trying to read her expression. Finally, she turned to him with tears in her eyes. "It is perfect," she said. "Jacob, it is absolutely perfect." Relief flooded through him. He dismounted and took her hand, leading her up onto the porch and through the door. Inside, the cabin was simple but well built. There was a stone fireplace Jacob had constructed himself, a table and chairs he had made from lodgepole pine, the new bed frame covered with furs and blankets. Shelves lined one wall, holding his few books and supplies. The windows he had cut into the walls were covered with the fabric he had purchased, creating curtains that softened the rough interior. "You did all this for me," Catherine said, looking around. "The curtains, the bed. I wanted you to feel welcome," Jacob said. "Wanted you to know that this is your home now, not just mine." Catherine set down the bundle she had been carrying and turned to face him. "Show me everything," she said. "I want to learn it all." Over the next weeks, Jacob taught Catherine the skills she would need to thrive in the wilderness. He showed her how to fish in the streams that tumbled down from the high country, how to set snares for rabbits, how to recognize which plants were edible and which were dangerous. Catherine proved to be a quick learner, approaching each new skill with the same dedication she had brought to teaching. She, in turn, brought changes to the cabin that made it feel more like a home. She organized Jacob's haphazard storage system, creating order from chaos. She planted a small garden in a sheltered spot near the cabin, late-season vegetables that might mature before the first hard frost. She filled the cabin with small touches that spoke of care and permanence. Wildflowers in a jar on the table, her books arranged on the shelves next to his, her dresses hanging beside his hunting clothes. But more than the physical changes, Catherine filled the cabin with warmth and life. She sang while she worked, her voice clear and sweet. She asked questions that made Jacob see familiar things in new ways. She laughed easily and often, finding joy in simple moments. The sunrise, a deer drinking from the creek, the way the wind moved through the pines. At night, they lay together in the bed Jacob had built, learning the language of each other's bodies. Jacob had been with women before, brief encounters in his younger years, but nothing had prepared him for the intimacy of truly loving someone. Catherine was both shy and curious, and they discovered together the ways pleasure could deepen the connection between them. One evening in early October, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset behind the mountains, Catherine told Jacob she was happier than she had ever been. "I keep thinking about my old life," she said, leaning against his side, "about how I thought I was content because I did not know anything different. But this, Jacob, this is what life is supposed to feel like you are exactly where you are meant to be." Jacob wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. "I felt that way the moment you stepped off that stagecoach." "Do you ever regret the life you gave up when you came to the mountains?" Catherine asked. Jacob thought about it carefully. "I used to feel guilty about leaving my family, but I do not regret the choice. Some people are meant to put down roots in one place and stay there their whole lives. I needed to find my own place, make my own way. And if I had not come here, I would never have written that description for the Western Settlers Exchange, and you would never have found me." "Fate," Catherine said softly. "Maybe," Jacob agreed, "or maybe just two lonely people who had the courage to reach out across the distance." The first snow came in late October, dusting the mountains with white. Jacob began the serious work of preparing for winter, cutting firewood and hunting game to fill the small smokehouse he had built. Catherine helped with everything, insisting on learning how to properly cure meat and prepare hides. Her hands, soft from years of gentler work, grew calloused and strong. One morning, Jacob woke to find Catherine standing at the window, wrapped in a blanket against the morning chill. She was staring out at the frost-covered meadow, and there was a pensive expression on her face. "What are you thinking about?" Jacob asked, coming to stand behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. "About Harold Brennan," Catherine admitted. "I received a letter yesterday forwarded from Willow Creek, from my sister." Jacob felt tension creep into his shoulders. "What did it say?" "Harold tried to follow me," Catherine said quietly. "He actually set out west, telling everyone he was going to bring me back to Riverbend. But he made it only as far as Omaha before he gave up and turned around. My sister said he came back furious and humiliated, and he has been telling everyone that I must have deceived him somehow, that I was never the respectable woman he thought I was." Jacob felt anger rise hot in his chest. "The man is a fool." "I know," Catherine said. She turned in his arms to face him. "And I do not care what he or anyone else in Riverbend thinks about me. But Jacob, what if he had followed me all the way here? What if he tries again?" Jacob looked down at his wife, at the hint of fear in her eyes, and felt the protective instinct that was never far from the surface surge forward. "Then he would have to go through me to get to you," he said, his voice hard. "And I promise you, Catherine, no man will ever take you somewhere you do not want to go. Not while I'm alive." Catherine relaxed against him. "I believe you," she said. "And that is such a relief. To know that I have someone who will stand with me, not someone trying to control me." "Always," Jacob promised. As winter deepened, they settled into a rhythm that felt as natural as breathing. Jacob hunted and trapped, providing meat and furs. Catherine managed the cabin, cooked their meals, and worked on sewing projects that would keep them warm through the long, cold months. In the evenings, they sat by the fire, and Catherine would read aloud from her books while Jacob worked on carving or repairing equipment. Sometimes they simply talked, continuing the deep conversations that had started in their letters. Jacob taught Catherine to shoot his rifle, insisting she know how to protect herself if he was ever away from the cabin. She proved to be a decent shot after some practice, and Jacob felt better knowing she had that skill. Catherine taught Jacob things too, though she probably did not realize it. She taught him the value of sharing every aspect of life with someone, of talking through problems instead of brooding over them alone. She taught him that strength could be gentle, that vulnerability was not weakness. She made him laugh, made him think, made him grateful every single day that he had been bold enough to write that letter asking her to come west. Christmas came, and they celebrated alone in their cabin. Jacob surprised Catherine with gifts he'd been secretly working on: a set of snowshoes he had crafted so she could walk in the deep snow, a carved wooden box for her letters and treasures, and a necklace made from polished stones he had collected from the creek. Catherine gave him a shirt she had sewn from fabric she had brought from Riverbend, decorated with delicate embroidery, and a journal she had created from bound paper, encouraging him to write down his thoughts and experiences. "You write such beautiful letters," she told him as he examined the journal. "I want you to keep writing, even though we are together now. Not to me, but for yourself. For our future children, maybe, so they can know what their father was thinking and feeling." Jacob pulled her into his lap, holding her close. "Our future children," he repeated. "I like the sound of that." "So do I," Catherine said softly. She rested her head on his shoulder. "Do you think about it? About having a family?" "I think about it all the time," Jacob admitted. "About a son or daughter who has your intelligence and my love of the wilderness. About teaching them to track and hunt while you teach them to read and think." "It sounds perfect," Catherine whispered. That night, they made love with a new tenderness, both of them thinking about the possibility of creating life together, of their family growing. January brought the hardest weather, with snowstorms that buried the cabin to the windowsills and temperatures that made it dangerous to venture far from the fire. But the cabin was warm and well supplied, and Jacob and Catherine found unexpected joy in being snowbound together. They told each other stories from their childhoods, played card games, made love in the middle of the day just because they could. Catherine declared it the best January of her life, and Jacob had to agree. In February, Catherine began feeling ill in the mornings. At first, they thought it might be something she had eaten, but when the nausea persisted, they both realized what it likely meant. Catherine was pregnant. Jacob felt fear and joy in equal measure. Joy at the thought of Catherine carrying their child, fear at the isolation of their cabin and the distance from any doctor or midwife. But Catherine, once the morning sickness passed each day, seemed only happy. "Women have been having babies in frontier conditions since the beginning of time," she reminded Jacob when he expressed his concerns. "My mother had all 4 of us, with only my father and a neighbor woman to help. We will manage." "When the time gets closer, we will go to Willow Creek," Jacob said firmly. "I want you near help, near someone who knows about childbirth." "We will see," Catherine said, which was not exactly agreement, but Jacob decided not to push the point. He had months to convince her. As winter slowly gave way to spring, Jacob noticed changes in Catherine beyond the growing swell of her belly. She seemed to glow with health and happiness, more beautiful than ever. She grew more confident in her wilderness skills, taking on tasks that would have seemed impossible to the schoolteacher who had arrived from Kansas. She checked the trap lines with Jacob, helped him process the pelts they had collected through the winter, and had learned to read the signs of changing weather almost as well as he could. In April, Jacob made the long journey to the trading post to sell their winter's catch. He brought back supplies they would need, including items for the baby, soft fabric for diapers and clothing, a cradle that Silas, the trading post owner, had made, herbs and medicines that might be useful during childbirth. Silas had looked at Jacob with new respect. "Heard you got married," the old man said. "Brought a woman all the way from Kansas, they say. Must be something special." "She is," Jacob said simply. "Bringing her down to Willow Creek when her time comes?" Silas asked. "Trying to convince her," Jacob admitted. Silas laughed. "Good luck with that. Strong women tend to have their own ideas about these things." Jacob returned to the cabin to find Catherine working in her expanded garden, planting seeds for summer vegetables. She stood when she saw him, one hand pressed to the small of her back, and smiled with such joy that Jacob felt his heart squeeze in his chest. He swept her into his arms, careful of her growing belly, and kissed her thoroughly. "I missed you," he said. "You You were only gone 4 days, Catherine laughed. 4 days too long, Jacob replied. That evening, as they unpacked the supplies Jacob had brought back, he broached the subject of going to Willow Creek for the birth. The baby is not due until September, Catherine said. We have plenty of time to decide. Catherine, Jacob said seriously, taking her hands, I need you to be safe. I need both of you to be safe. Please humor me in this. Catherine looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. All right, she said. When August comes, we will go to Willow Creek. But Jacob, you have to promise me that after the baby is born and we know we are both healthy, we can come back here. This is our home. I do not want to raise our child anywhere else. I promise, Jacob said, relief flooding through him. Summer was glorious. The mountains were green and lush, the meadows filled with wildflowers. Catherine's belly grew round and prominent, and Jacob found himself constantly amazed by the evidence of the life they had created. He would rest his hand on her stomach in the evenings, feeling the baby kick and move, marveling at the strength of those tiny movements. Catherine remained active throughout the pregnancy, insisting that keeping busy was better than sitting idle. She preserved food for the coming winter, sewed tiny clothes for the baby, and continued to help Jacob with the daily work of maintaining their homestead. Jacob hovered near her constantly, ready to help with any task that seemed too strenuous, until Catherine finally told him she loved him, but he needed to stop treating her like she was made of glass. I am pregnant, not fragile, she said, exasperated but amused. Women work throughout pregnancy. It is normal. You're carrying my child, Jacob countered. Nothing about that feels normal to me. It feels miraculous and terrifying. Catherine's expression softened. She took his face in her hands. I am healthy. The baby is healthy, and everything is going exactly as it should. You need to trust that. I trust you, Jacob said. It is everything else I worry about. In mid-August, they prepared for the journey to Willow Creek. Catherine was now heavily pregnant, moving more slowly but still insisting she felt fine. Jacob packed carefully, bringing everything they might need for an extended stay. He had arranged ahead of time for them to rent a small house on the edge of Willow Creek, a place where Catherine could be comfortable and where help would be nearby when the baby came. The journey took 4 days instead of the usual 3, with frequent stops to let Catherine rest. Jacob kept a watchful eye on her, looking for any signs of distress, but Catherine remained in good spirits. She talked to the baby as they traveled, telling their child about the mountains and valleys they were passing through, describing the home they would return to. They reached Willow Creek on a warm August evening. The small house Jacob had arranged was simple but comfortable, with a wood stove, a real bed, and windows that let in the evening breeze. A woman named Mrs. Patterson, who served as the settlement's midwife, came by to introduce herself and examine Catherine. Strong and healthy, Mrs. Patterson pronounced. The baby is positioned well. I would say you have another 3 or 4 weeks maybe. You did right coming to town, though. Always better to be near help for a first baby. Those weeks of waiting were hard for Jacob. He was used to being active, to spending his days in productive work, but there was little to do in Willow Creek except wait. He occupied himself with odd jobs around the settlement, helping repair buildings and chop wood, anything to keep busy and earn a bit of extra money. Catherine spent her days resting, visiting with the other women in the settlement, and preparing for the baby's arrival. Jacob could see that she missed the cabin, missed the solitude and beauty of their mountain home. He promised her repeatedly that as soon as she and the baby were strong enough, they would return. On a September night when the air carried the first hint of autumn cold, Catherine woke Jacob with a hand on his shoulder. Jacob, she said calmly, though he could hear the tension underneath, I think it is time. Jacob bolted upright, instantly alert. I will get Mrs. Patterson, he said, already moving toward the door. Jacob, Catherine called after him. When he turned back, she was smiling despite the obvious discomfort. I love you, and everything is going to be fine. I love you too, Jacob said. Then he ran. Mrs. Patterson arrived quickly, took one look at Catherine, and sent Jacob to fetch 2 other women who assisted with births. Then she firmly told Jacob he needed to stay out of the main room while they worked. But I want to be with her, Jacob protested. And you will be, Mrs. Patterson said kindly but firmly. But right now, your wife needs room to work, and you will be in the way. I promise I will call you if she asks for you. Jacob found himself relegated to the front porch, pacing like a caged animal. He could hear sounds from inside the house, Catherine's voice raised in pain, the low murmurs of the women attending her. Every cry from Catherine made him want to break down the door and go to her, but he forced himself to stay outside. This was her trial to face, and he had to trust the women who knew what they were doing. The night stretched endlessly. Other men from the settlement came by, offering support and flasks of whiskey, telling him stories of their own children's births. Jacob barely heard them. All his attention was focused on the house, on Catherine, on praying to a God he rarely spoke to that she would be all right. Dawn was breaking when he finally heard a new sound, the wail of an infant. Jacob froze, his heart stopping, then starting again with a fierce beat. A moment later, Mrs. Patterson appeared at the door, tired but smiling. "You have a son," she said, "and your wife is asking for you." Jacob pushed past her into the house. Catherine lay in the bed, her hair damp with sweat, her face exhausted but glowing. In her arms was a tiny bundle wrapped in soft cloth. Jacob approached slowly, hardly daring to breathe. "Come meet your son," Catherine said softly. Jacob sat on the edge of the bed and looked down at the infant in Catherine's arms. He was perfect, tiny and red-faced, with a shock of dark hair and small fists waving in the air. Jacob reached out one large, calloused finger and touched the baby's hand. Immediately, the infant's fingers wrapped around Jacob's finger with surprising strength. "He is perfect," Jacob whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "Catherine, he is perfect." "He has your stubbornness," Catherine said with a tired laugh. "He took his time coming into the world." "Are you all right?" Jacob asked, tearing his eyes from his son to look at his wife. "Exhausted," Catherine admitted, "but yes, I am all right. We both are." Jacob leaned forward and kissed her forehead, then her lips, trying to pour all his love and relief into the touch. "You are incredible," he said. "So strong and brave. I have never been more in awe of anyone." They named the baby Thomas, after Catherine's father. Thomas Hayes, born on September 17, 1877, in a small settlement in the Montana Territory. He was small but healthy, with a powerful set of lungs and an appetite that kept Catherine busy nursing him. Mrs. Patterson insisted that Catherine rest for at least 2 weeks before attempting the journey back to the cabin. Jacob was grateful for the caution, wanting to ensure both Catherine and Thomas were strong enough for the trip. He spent those weeks learning to be a father, changing diapers with clumsy but determined hands, walking Thomas around the small house at night when he fussed, staring at his son with constant amazement. Catherine recovered quickly, her natural strength reasserting itself. By the end of the second week, she was restless and ready to go home. "I want Thomas to grow up in the mountains," she told Jacob. "I want that to be his first home." They made the journey back to the cabin in early October, traveling slowly and carefully with their precious cargo. Thomas was a good traveler, seeming content as long as he was fed and held. Jacob and Catherine took turns carrying him, and at night they all slept together in Jacob's bedroll, the baby nestled safely between them. Returning to the cabin felt like a homecoming. Catherine stood on the porch holding Thomas, looking out at the mountains, and Jacob saw tears in her eyes. "What is wrong?" he asked, concerned. "Nothing," Catherine said. "Everything is right. This is home, Jacob. Our home. Our family's home." That winter was different from the one before. The cabin was filled with the sounds of a baby, crying, cooing, the soft noises of nursing. Sleep became a precious commodity, snatched in brief intervals between Thomas's demands. But despite the exhaustion, Jacob had never been happier. Watching Catherine with their son, seeing the gentle way she handled him, the love in her eyes, made Jacob fall even more deeply in love with her. Catherine adapted to motherhood with the same determination she had brought to learning wilderness skills. She figured out how to manage Thomas's needs while also managing the household, often with Thomas strapped to her back in a carrier Jacob had fashioned. She sang to him constantly, talked to him about everything she was doing, read to him from her books even though he was far too young to understand. Jacob learned to hunt and trap while being attuned to any sounds from the cabin, always ready to hurry back if Catherine needed him. He carved toys for Thomas, including a set of wooden blocks and a small horse. He took to talking to his son while he worked, telling Thomas about the mountains, the animals, the way to read the sky for weather. As Thomas grew from a tiny infant into a sturdy baby, Jacob and Catherine marveled at every change, every new skill. His first smile, the first time he rolled over, the day he sat up on his own, each milestone felt like a miracle. One evening in March, when Thomas was 6 months old, Catherine and Jacob sat together by the fire watching their son play with his wooden blocks on a blanket on the floor. "I never imagined this," Catherine said softly. "When I was teaching in Riverbend, living in that boarding house, I never let myself imagine anything like this. A family, a home where I felt truly myself, a man who sees me as an equal partner." "I never imagined it either," Jacob admitted. "I thought I would spend my life alone in these mountains, and I told myself I was content with that. But you showed me what I was missing. You brought life and love into a world that I had made too small." "Do you think Thomas will love the mountains the way you do?" Catherine asked. Jacob looked at his son, who was chewing on a wooden block with intense concentration. "I hope he will love them," Jacob said. "But more than that, I hope we raise him to follow his own path, wherever it leads, the way you had the courage to leave Riverbend and find your own way." "And the way you left your family's farm to find yours," Catherine added. She leaned against Jacob's shoulder. "We will raise him to be brave and kind, to think for himself, and stand up for what he believes in. And to respect women as equals," Jacob said. "I never want him to be the kind of man who tries to control or diminish the women in his life." Catherine smiled. "With us as parents, I think he will turn out just fine." Spring brought new life to the mountains, and Thomas became increasingly alert and engaged with the world around him. Catherine would take him outside, showing him the flowers and trees, letting him feel the texture of bark and soft grass. Jacob built a small fenced area near the cabin where Thomas could safely play outside while they worked. In June, a letter arrived at the trading post forwarded to Jacob. It was from Catherine's sister, writing to tell them that their youngest brother had gotten married. She included news of Riverbend, mentioning that Harold Brennan had finally married a woman his family approved of, though rumor had it the marriage was more business arrangement than love match. "Do you regret it?" Jacob asked Catherine after she finished reading the letter aloud. "Not being there for your brother's wedding?" Catherine folded the letter carefully. "I miss my siblings," she said honestly. "And I wish they could meet Thomas, could see how happy I am. But regret? No, I made my choice, and it was the right one." "We could visit," Jacob suggested, "when Thomas is a bit older. Take the train east for a few weeks." Catherine's face lit up. "Could we really?" "If you want to," Jacob said. "I want your family to know Thomas, to see that you made a good life. And I want to meet the people who helped shape you into the woman you are." Catherine threw her arms around him, causing Thomas to crow with delight from his spot on the floor. "That would be wonderful," she said. "Not yet, maybe not for another year or two. But someday." As summer settled over the mountains, Jacob reflected on how much his life had changed in just 2 years. 2 years ago, he had been alone, convinced that solitude was what he needed. Then Catherine's letter had arrived, and everything had shifted. Now he could not imagine life without her, without Thomas, without the family they had built together. One afternoon, he and Catherine took Thomas on a walk to one of Jacob's favorite spots, a high meadow with a view of the surrounding peaks. Catherine spread a blanket and sat with Thomas in her lap, while Jacob stretched out beside them. "Tell me what you love most about this life," Catherine said, playing with Thomas's chubby hands. Jacob thought about it. "I love that we built it ourselves," he said finally. "No one told us how to live or what to do. We chose each other, chose this place, chose to create something entirely our own. And I love that we are partners in every sense. You are not just my wife, Catherine. You are my equal, my companion, my best friend." "I love that too," Catherine said. "And I love that we are raising Thomas to understand that love is not about one person being in charge and the other obeying. It is about two people choosing each other every day, working together to build a life." "He is lucky to have you as a mother," Jacob said. "He is lucky to have us both," Catherine corrected. She looked out at the mountains, at the endless vista of peaks and valleys. "You know, I used to think I was being reckless, leaving everything behind to come west to a man I had never met. But it was not reckless. It was brave, and it was the best decision I ever made." Jacob sat up and pulled her close, careful not to jostle Thomas. "I think about that first letter you sent," he said, "about how easily you might never have written it, or I might never have responded, all the tiny choices that led to this moment." "Do you believe in fate?" Catherine asked. "I believe we make our own fate," Jacob said, "through courage and choice. You had the courage to write to me, to leave your old life behind. I had the courage to ask you to come west, to open my heart to you. And because of those choices, we have this." Thomas chose that moment to grab at Jacob's beard, his favorite thing to do, and both parents laughed. The years that followed brought both challenges and joys. The winters were always hard, the isolation sometimes difficult, especially as Thomas grew into a curious, energetic toddler who required constant supervision. But Catherine and Jacob faced everything together, supporting each other through the tough times and celebrating the good ones. When Thomas was 2, Catherine became pregnant again. This time, Jacob was less panicked, having been through it once before. Still, when the time came, they made the journey to Willow Creek, and in September of 1879, Catherine gave birth to a daughter they named Sarah. Sarah was different from her brother from the start, quieter and more observant, with Catherine's dark eyes and Jacob's stubborn determination. Thomas, now a sturdy 2-year-old, was fascinated by his baby sister and wanted to help with everything, though his help often created more work than it saved. With 2 children, the cabin felt smaller, and Jacob spent the winter building an addition, expanding the single room into a proper house with separate sleeping spaces. Catherine helped when she could, holding boards steady while Jacob nailed them in place, with Sarah strapped to her back and Thomas playing nearby. When Thomas was 4 and Sarah 2, they finally made the trip back east to visit Catherine's family. It was a grand adventure, traveling by stagecoach and train across the country. Catherine's siblings were overjoyed to see her, to meet Jacob, and to dote on their niece and nephew. Catherine's sister admitted that she had been wrong to call Catherine reckless, that seeing how happy she was made it clear she had made the right choice. They stayed for 6 weeks, and while it was good to visit, Jacob could tell Catherine was eager to return home. The busy streets and crowds of even the small Kansas town felt overwhelming after years in the mountains. When they finally boarded the train to head back west, both Catherine and Jacob breathed sighs of relief. "Did you enjoy the visit?" Jacob asked as they settled into their seats, Thomas already asleep against his shoulder and Sarah in Catherine's arms. "I did," Catherine said, "but I'm ready to go home. I realized something while we were there. I am not the woman who left Riverbend anymore. That life feels like it belonged to someone else. The mountains, our cabin, our life there. That is who I am now." "Me too," Jacob said. "I mean, I am glad we came. But being away made me appreciate what we have even more." The children grew, and the cabin in the mountains rang with their laughter and occasional tears. Jacob taught them wilderness skills from an early age, while Catherine made sure they learned to read, write, and do arithmetic. She was determined that her children would have education, even if they were growing up far from formal schools. Thomas showed signs of having his father's love for the wilderness, always eager to follow Jacob on his hunting and trapping expeditions. Sarah was more like her mother, preferring books and learning, though she also proved surprisingly skilled at tracking and observation. When Thomas was 7, he asked Jacob about his letters to Catherine. "Grandma said you and Ma wrote letters before you met," Thomas said. "How did you know you loved her if you had never seen her?" Jacob and Catherine exchanged smiles. "I knew her heart," Jacob explained. "Through her words, I learned what kind of person she was, and that mattered more than what she looked like." "But what if she was ugly?" Thomas asked with the blunt honesty of childhood. "Thomas," Catherine said, trying not to laugh. "Your mother is beautiful," Jacob said seriously. "But even if she looked completely different from how she does, I would still love her. Because I fell in love with her mind, her kindness, her courage. Those things do not change." "That is how you know it is real love," Catherine added, "when it is based on who someone truly is, not just how they appear." As the years passed, Jacob and Catherine built more than just a home in the mountains. They built a life rich with meaning and connection. They were partners in every sense, sharing work and decisions equally. Their marriage was not without disagreements. They were both too strong-willed for that. but they had learned to talk through problems, to listen to each other, to compromise when necessary. Jacob never stopped being amazed by Catherine's strength and capability. She could dress a deer, mend a shirt, teach a child to read, and make a simple cabin feel like a warm home, often all in the same day. She had become as comfortable in the wilderness as he was, though she never lost her love of books and learning. Catherine never stopped being grateful for Jacob's respect and partnership. He consulted her on decisions, valued her opinions, and shared all aspects of their life with her. He was a devoted father, patient with the children's endless questions, and generous with his time, and he never stopped making her feel cherished and loved. In the spring of 1884, when Thomas was 7 and Sarah 5, Catherine discovered she was pregnant again. She was 33 years old now, and both she and Jacob worried that this pregnancy might be harder than the previous ones. But Catherine remained healthy, and in November of that year she gave birth to another son, whom they named Daniel. Daniel was a surprise in more ways than one. He had bright red hair, a trait that must have come from some distant ancestor, and a sunny temperament that made him easy to love. Thomas and Sarah doted on their baby brother, fighting over who got to hold him. With 3 children, the cabin was truly full, bustling with activity and noise. Jacob built more additions until the original single room had grown into a proper homestead with multiple rooms, a covered porch that wrapped around 2 sides, and a barn for their horses and the cow they had acquired. Catherine often reflected on how different her life was from what she had once imagined. She had thought she might spend her life as a spinster teacher, respected, but ultimately alone. Instead, she had love, partnership, children, and a home in one of the most beautiful places in the world. The work was hard, the isolation sometimes challenging, but she would not trade it for anything. The children grew, each developing their own personality and interests. Thomas became his father's shadow, learning everything Jacob could teach him about wilderness survival and mountain life. Sarah divided her time between helping her mother with household tasks and exploring on her own, often bringing back detailed observations about plants and animals. Daniel, as he grew from baby to toddler, proved to be fearless and adventurous, giving his parents constant worry and amusement in equal measure. When Thomas was 14, a young man nearly as tall as his father and already skilled in wilderness survival, he asked Jacob about his own youth. "Did you always know you wanted to live in the mountains?" Thomas asked as they worked together, processing a deer Jacob had hunted. Jacob thought about the question carefully. "No," he admitted. "When I was your age, I was confused. I knew I did not want the life my father expected me to live, but I did not yet know what I did want. It took courage to leave, to disappoint my family, and strike out on my own." "Do you think I will want to leave?" Thomas asked quietly. Jacob looked at his son, at the worry in his young face. "I think you will choose your own path, whatever that is. Maybe you will want to stay here in the mountains. Maybe you will want to see what is beyond them. Either way, your mother and I will support your choice." "Ma left everything to come here," Thomas said. "That must have been scary." "It was brave," Jacob corrected. "The bravest thing I have ever seen anyone do. And it taught me something important, that love is about giving people freedom to choose, not trying to keep them in a box." That night, Jacob told Catherine about the conversation. They lay together in their bed, the cabin quiet with all 3 children asleep. "He is growing up," Catherine said softly. "In a few years, he will be a man." "I know," Jacob said. "Does that worry you?" "A little," Catherine admitted. "I want him to be happy, to find his own way. But I also hope his way includes staying close enough that we can still see him, know him." "Whatever he chooses, we raised him right," Jacob said. "We raised him to think for himself, to be strong and kind. That is all we can do." "I know," Catherine said. She curled against Jacob's side, resting her head on his chest. "Jacob, we have built a good life, have we not?" "The best life," Jacob agreed. "Catherine, do you remember what you wrote in that first letter? About feeling like you were living a life that had been chosen for you rather than one you chose yourself?" "I remember," Catherine said. "You gave that to me too," Jacob said. "I thought I had chosen my life by coming to the mountains, but I was still only half alive, going through the motions. You taught me what it means to truly live, to be vulnerable, to love, to be part of something larger than myself. Catherine lifted her head to look at him in the dim moonlight filtering through the window. We taught each other, she said. That is what partnership means. Jacob pulled her close and kissed her, a kiss that still held all the passion and love of their early days together, tempered now with the deeper connection of years shared. More years passed, bringing changes but also continuity. Thomas, at 16, announced that he wanted to become a guide, leading hunters and settlers through the mountains. Jacob helped him develop the skills he would need, teaching him not just survival, but how to teach others, how to keep people safe in the wilderness. Sarah, at 14, shocked them by announcing she wanted to become a doctor. I know it is unusual for a woman, she said, chin lifted defiantly. But Ma taught me that women can do anything men can do, and I want to help people. Catherine and Jacob supported her ambition, though they knew it would mean sending her away for education. They began saving money, planning for the day when Sarah would leave the mountains to pursue her dreams. Daniel, at 10, was still too young to know what he wanted, but he showed signs of having inherited his mother's love of learning and his father's physical courage. He could sit for hours reading or studying, then immediately jump up to climb the tallest tree or explore a new cave. In the fall of 1894, Jacob turned 44 years old. He was still strong and healthy, his body hardened by years of physical labor, though his hair now showed threads of silver and his face bore the marks of a life lived outdoors. Catherine was 42, her dark hair also streaked with gray, her face lined but still beautiful to Jacob's eyes. They stood together on the porch of their cabin on a golden October evening, watching the sun set behind the mountains. Thomas was away working as a guide, Sarah was preparing to leave for medical school in the spring, and Daniel was inside doing his evening studies. 17 years, Catherine said softly. 17 years since I stepped off that stagecoach in Willow Creek. Best 17 years of my life, Jacob said, wrapping his arm around her waist. Mine too, Catherine agreed. Jacob, do you ever wonder what would have happened if I had not written that first letter? If you had not responded? I try not to, Jacob said, because thinking about a life without you is unbearable. I would have stayed in Riverbend, Catherine said. Probably would have eventually married someone appropriate, lived a perfectly fine but ultimately empty life. I would never have known what I was missing. And I would have grown old alone in these mountains, convinced I was content, Jacob said, never knowing that I was only half alive. Catherine turned in his arms to face him. We saved each other, she said. We did, Jacob agreed. You had the courage to reach out across the distance, to take a chance on words and hope, and that courage changed everything. They kissed as the sun painted the sky in shades of gold and pink, two people who had found each other against all odds and built a life together that was richer than either could have imagined. Inside the cabin, Daniel called out that dinner was ready. Jacob and Catherine broke apart, smiling at each other. Come on, Catherine said, taking Jacob's hand. Our son cooked dinner. This should be interesting. As they walked inside together, Jacob reflected on the journey that had brought them here, from loneliness to love, from isolation to family, from merely surviving to truly living. All because a woman named Catherine Morgan had been brave enough to write a letter, and a man named Jacob Hayes had been brave enough to answer. The next spring brought bittersweet changes. Sarah left for medical school in Chicago, carrying with her the full support of her parents and a substantial portion of their savings. Catherine cried when they saw her off at Willow Creek, though she was proud beyond measure of her daughter's ambition and courage. Thomas, now 18 and a skilled guide, had built his own small cabin closer to Willow Creek, making it easier for him to meet clients and lead expeditions. He came home often, and Jacob could see that while his son loved the mountains, he had also inherited Catherine's social nature and enjoyed being around people more than Jacob ever had. Daniel, at 12, had truly come into his own. He had his mother's gift for observation and learning, but he also had a creative streak that neither parent had expected. He drew constantly, sketching the mountains and wildlife with increasing skill, and he had recently started writing stories about mountain life. We have raised quite the family, Jacob said to Catherine one evening as they sat alone, a rare occurrence now. A guide, a future doctor, and an artist-writer. None of them exactly following in our footsteps, Catherine observed with amusement. No, Jacob agreed, but they are all following their own paths, being true to themselves. Is that not what we wanted? It is exactly what we wanted, Catherine said. She reached across the table and took Jacob's hand. Jacob, I've been thinking. We are not old, but we are not young anymore either. And the children are grown, or nearly so. What do you want for the next part of our lives? Jacob considered the question. I want to keep living here, in these mountains, with you. I want to watch our children build their own lives and maybe, eventually, meet our grandchildren. I want to wake up every morning next to you and go to sleep every night the same way. What about you? The same, Catherine said simply. This life, this place, with you. It is all I want. Though I would like to travel a bit more, see some of the places we have only read about. Then we will, Jacob promised. Once Daniel's a bit older, once we are sure he does not need us as much, we will travel. I will take you anywhere you want to go. Anywhere? Catherine asked with a smile. Well, maybe not anywhere, Jacob amended. I'm a mountain man, after all. I need trees and clean air. Catherine laughed, the sound as bright and joyful as it had been when she was 25 and stepping off that stagecoach. I love you, Jacob Hayes. I love you too, Catherine Hayes. Always have, always will. As summer settled over the mountains, they fell into a new rhythm. With only Daniel at home and him increasingly independent, Jacob and Catherine had more time for each other. They took long walks together, revisiting favorite spots from their early years. They sat together in the evenings, reading aloud to each other the way they used to before the children came. They made love with the leisure and deep knowledge of long familiarity, their passion mellowed but not diminished by time. Letters came regularly from Sarah, full of details about her medical studies. She was thriving in Chicago, though she wrote that she missed the mountains and could not wait to return. Thomas sent news of his guiding business, which was growing steadily. He had even hired 2 younger men to help him, expanding into a real enterprise. In August, Thomas brought a young woman home to meet his parents. Her name was Mary, and she was the daughter of a settler family Thomas had guided to their new homestead. She was pretty and practical, with a ready smile and a no-nonsense attitude that reminded Jacob of Catherine. Well? Thomas asked nervously after dinner when he and Jacob stepped outside. What do you think? I think she seems like a fine woman, Jacob said carefully, but what matters is what you think. Do you love her? I do, Thomas said immediately. She is strong and smart, and she understands what life out here requires. She does not want to change me or tame me. She wants to build a life with me as I am. Jacob smiled, remembering the letters that had brought Catherine into his life. Then she is perfect, he said. When are you going to marry her? Thomas grinned. I was hoping you would ask. I want to propose, but I wanted to make sure you and Ma approved first. We approve, Jacob said. And Thomas, I am proud of you. You found someone who sees you for who you are and loves you anyway. That is rare and precious. Thomas and Mary married that September in Willow Creek, with the whole family in attendance. Even Sarah made the long journey from Chicago to be there for her brother's wedding. It was a joyous celebration, made more so by the obvious love between the bride and groom. Standing at his son's wedding, watching Thomas and Mary exchange vows, Jacob's mind drifted back to his own wedding 17 years earlier. He and Catherine had married quickly, knowing each other only through letters and a few days of acquaintance. It had been a leap of faith, a gamble on love and hope. But that gamble had paid off beyond his wildest dreams. He looked over at Catherine, standing beside him, and found her already watching him. She smiled, and he knew she was thinking the same thing. They had started with letters and courage, and they had built something lasting and true. After the wedding, life settled back into its comfortable patterns. Thomas and Mary built a house near his cabin by Willow Creek, and within a year, they announced that Catherine and Jacob would be grandparents. The news filled them both with joy and a strange sense of time's passage. We are going to be grandparents, Catherine said wonderingly. When did we get old enough for that? We are not old, Jacob protested. We are experienced, Catherine laughed. Is that what we are calling it? Thomas and Mary's son was born in the spring of 1897, a healthy boy they named Jacob after his grandfather. When Jacob held his grandson for the first time, feeling the weight of the tiny body in his large hands, he felt the circle of life complete itself. This child carried his name, would grow up in these same mountains, would perhaps hear stories about how his grandparents had found each other through letters and courage. Sarah finished medical school and returned west, but not to Montana. She had fallen in love with a fellow medical student, a serious young man named Robert who shared her passion for helping people. They settled in Denver, where they opened a medical practice together, serving the growing population of the city. When Sarah brought Robert home to meet her parents, Jacob could see that this man understood and respected his daughter's intelligence and ambition. Robert did not see Sarah's medical career as a threat or an oddity, but as an essential part of who she was. Jacob gave them his blessing with gratitude that his daughter had found the kind of partnership he and Catherine shared. Daniel, at 16, had started submitting his drawings and stories to newspapers and magazines. To everyone's surprise, some had been accepted and published. He earned a small income from his work, enough that he talked about trying to make a living as an artist and writer. "You really raised them to follow their dreams," Jacob's old friend Silas commented one day at the trading post. Jacob had ridden down to sell furs and stock up on supplies. "Not many parents do that." "Catherine gets the credit," Jacob said. "She taught them to think for themselves, to believe they could be anything they wanted." "You taught them too," Silas countered. "Taught them by example what it means to live with integrity, to choose your own path even when it is hard." Jacob thought about that as he rode back to the cabin. He supposed it was true. He and Catherine had shown their children, through their own lives and choices, that it was possible to build a life that was authentic and fulfilling, even if it did not follow traditional paths. The turn of the century came, marking a new era. Jacob was 50 years old, Catherine 48. They had lived in their mountain cabin for more than 20 years, had raised 3 children to adulthood, and had built a love that had only deepened with time. One evening, as they sat together watching the sunset from their porch, Catherine said, "Jacob, do you remember what you wrote in that letter? The one where you asked me to come west?" "I remember every word," Jacob said. "You wrote that I should come not as a stranger seeking help, but as a woman you would be honored to know, to protect, to build a life with," Catherine recited. "You kept that promise. You have honored me every day, protected me when I needed it without diminishing my strength, and we have built a beautiful life together." "You kept your promise too," Jacob said. "You said in one of your early letters that you wanted a life you chose, not one chosen for you. You gave that to me as well. You chose me, chose this life, and you never looked back." "I never wanted to look back," Catherine said. "This has been everything I dreamed of and more." "Jacob, I want you to know that even if I could go back and change anything, make different choices, I would not. Every hardship, every challenge has been worth it because I went through it with you." Jacob pulled her close. This woman who had changed his life with a letter, who had been brave enough to cross the country to find him, who had built a life with him in the wilderness. "I love you, Catherine Hayes. I loved you before I met you. I loved you the moment I saw you step off that stagecoach, and I will love you until my last breath." "And beyond," Catherine said softly. "Our love will continue in our children, in their children, in the life we built here in these mountains." As the sun set behind the peaks, painting the sky in brilliant colors, Jacob and Catherine sat together in peaceful contentment. Their story had started with letters, with words on paper carried across vast distances. But those words had been the seeds from which a great love had grown, a love that had weathered storms and celebrated joys, a love that had created life and legacy. Thomas and Mary had given them 3 grandchildren by 1905. Sarah and Robert had 2. Daniel had married a young woman he met while selling his drawings in Denver, and they had started their family as well. The cabin in the mountains had become the center of a growing family, a place where children and grandchildren came to visit, to hear stories, to learn about the wilderness from their grandfather, and about courage and independence from their grandmother. Jacob, now 55, had slowed down somewhat, though he was still strong and active. His hair was more silver than dark now, and his face bore the marks of a life lived fully. Catherine, at 53, had gray hair she wore in a simple bun, and reading glasses she used for her beloved books. But to Jacob's eyes, she was as beautiful as the day he first saw her. They had traveled some in recent years, taking the train to visit their children and grandchildren, even going as far as San Francisco once. But they always returned to the mountains, to the cabin that was their true home. One spring morning, as they walked together through the meadow filled with wildflowers, Catherine stopped suddenly. "Jacob," she said, "look." Jacob followed her gaze and saw a young elk, barely more than a calf, standing at the edge of the tree line. It watched them with large, curious eyes, unafraid. "That is how I felt when I first came here," Catherine said softly. "Like that elk, new to this world, curious, a little uncertain but not truly afraid. Because I knew you would protect me and teach me." "And you taught me just as much," Jacob reminded her. "You taught me that strength is not the same as isolation, that vulnerability is a kind of courage, that love makes life worth living." The elk bounded away, disappearing into the trees. Jacob and Catherine continued their walk, hand in hand, two people who had found each other against all odds and had built something lasting and true. In the summer of 1906, Thomas organized a family gathering at Jacob and Catherine's cabin. All three of their children came, bringing spouses and grandchildren. The cabin and surrounding area were filled with the sounds of family, children playing, adults talking and laughing, the kind of joyful noise that Jacob had once thought he would never experience. As he sat on the porch watching his family, Jacob felt Catherine settle beside him. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "I am thinking about that day in the trading post, when I first opened your letter," Jacob said. "If someone had told me then that in 30 years I would be sitting here surrounded by children and grandchildren, that I would have built this life with an incredible woman, I would never have believed it." "I am thinking about Riverbend," Catherine said. "About the life I would have had if I had stayed. I probably would have eventually married someone suitable. I might have been content in a way, but I would never have known what it felt like to be truly alive, truly myself." "Do you ever wonder what happened to Harold Brennan?" Jacob asked. Catherine shrugged. "I heard through my sister that he inherited his father's business, had several children with his wife. I hope he is happy in his own way, but I am grateful every day that I had the courage to refuse him, to choose my own path instead." That evening, after dinner, Thomas asked his father to tell the story of how he and Catherine had met. The grandchildren gathered around, eager to hear the tale they had heard before but never tired of. Jacob looked at Catherine, and she nodded, smiling. Together, they told the story. Catherine talked about her life in Riverbend, about finding Jacob's name in the correspondence journal, about gathering the courage to write that first letter. Jacob talked about his solitary life in the mountains, about receiving her letter and feeling something shift in his heart. "So you fell in love without ever meeting?" their oldest grandson asked, eyes wide. We fell in love with each other's minds and hearts first," Catherine explained. "When we finally met in person, we already knew the most important things about each other." "Grandpa, were you scared when you asked Grandma to come west?" one of the younger grandchildren asked. "Terrified," Jacob admitted. "I was asking her to give up everything familiar, to come across the country to a place and a man she had never seen. I was afraid she would say no, or that she would come and regret it." "But I did not regret it," Catherine said, reaching for Jacob's hand. "Not for one single day. Because your grandfather gave me the greatest gift anyone can give. The freedom to be completely myself, to grow and learn and build a life on my own terms." "And your grandmother gave me the same gift," Jacob added. "She taught me that love is not about possession or control. It is about two people choosing to walk through life side by side, equal partners in everything." Later that night, after the family had settled down to sleep, scattered through the cabin and in tents set up outside, Jacob and Catherine lay together in their bed. "It is a good legacy," Catherine said softly. "3 children who know their own minds and followed their own paths. Grandchildren who are growing up seeing what real partnership looks like." "It is your legacy," Jacob said. "You had the courage to start it all." "It is our legacy," Catherine corrected, "built together, one day at a time, one choice at a time." Jacob pulled her close, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair, feeling the warmth of her body against his. They had been together for 30 years, had built a life and a family, had weathered storms and celebrated joys. The passion had mellowed into something deeper and more sustaining, but it was still there, the fundamental love that had drawn them together from across the country. "I love you, Catherine Hayes," Jacob whispered. Thank you for writing that first letter. Thank you for being brave enough to take a chance on a mountain man you had never met." "I love you too, Jacob Hayes," Catherine replied. "Thank you for answering. Thank you for asking me to come west. Thank you for every single day we have had together." They fell asleep, wrapped in each other's arms, two people who had found each other through words on paper and had built a love that would echo through generations. The years continued to pass, bringing the changes that time always brings. Jacob and Catherine grew older, their bodies slowing, but their love remaining constant. They celebrated their 30th anniversary, then their 35th. Their grandchildren grew, some of them showing signs of the same independence and courage that had characterized their grandparents. One of Thomas's daughters announced she wanted to become a teacher like her grandmother had been. Sarah's oldest son talked about becoming a mountain guide like his Uncle Thomas. Daniel's children all showed artistic talent, carrying on their father's creative legacy. Jacob and Catherine watched it all with pride and gratitude. They had lived to see the fruit of their courage, the ripple effects of their choice to reach out across the distance and build something together. In the spring of 1914, Jacob turned 64 and Catherine 62. They were grandparents many times over now, and even great-grandparents to Thomas and Mary's first grandchild. The mountain cabin that had once housed just Jacob alone now stood at the center of a sprawling family network. On a warm May evening, Jacob and Catherine took one of their familiar walks through the meadow. Spring wildflowers carpeted the ground, the same flowers that had been blooming when Catherine first arrived 37 years earlier. "Do you remember the first time we walked through this meadow together?" Catherine asked. "I remember every moment of those first days," Jacob said. "The way you looked at the mountains with such wonder, the sound of your laugh, the feeling that my life had finally begun." "Mine too," Catherine agreed. She stopped walking and turned to face the cabin, visible in the distance. "We built something good here, Jacob. Not just a home, but a legacy of love and courage and independence." "We did," Jacob agreed, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "And it all started with your courage. You wrote that letter, Catherine. You took the first step." "And you took the next one," Catherine reminded him. "You invited me to come west. You opened your heart and your life to me." They stood there for a long moment, wrapped in each other's arms, looking at the home they had built together. The mountains rose around them, eternal and beautiful, bearing witness to the love story that had unfolded in their shadow. "Whatever happens," Catherine said softly, "whatever the future brings, I want you to know that this life we built together has been the greatest joy of my existence. You made me braver than I knew I could be, Jacob. You gave me a life of adventure and meaning." "And you gave me a reason to live instead of just survive," Jacob replied. "You taught me that opening your heart is not weakness, but the greatest strength. I would not trade a single day of our life together, not for anything." As the sun began to set, they walked back to the cabin hand in hand, two people who had started as strangers connected by words on paper and had become the love story that their children and grandchildren told as inspiration. Jacob and Catherine Hayes lived out their days in their mountain cabin, surrounded by the family they had created and the love they had built. When people asked them the secret to their lasting love, they always gave the same answer: courage to be vulnerable, respect for each other's independence, and the daily choice to be partners in every aspect of life. And it had all started with a letter written by a brave woman who refused to accept the life others expected her to live, sent to a solitary mountain man who had been waiting without knowing it for someone to share his wilderness with. From those words on paper had grown a love that spanned decades, a family that stretched across the frontier, and a legacy that would continue long after they were gone. In the end, their story was simple. She was the woman whose letters made him ride east in spirit, if not in body, reaching across the distance to meet her heart with his. And together, they had created something neither could have built alone, a life of purpose, passion, and profound partnership that proved love, when built on respect and courage, could weather any storm and last for a lifetime.